Well, kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. It's Rachel Froggatt here, Secretary General of the International Working Group on Women in Sport. And for those Kiwis joining us on the line today, of course, Chief Executive here in New Zealand for Women in Sport, Aotearoa. So welcome to the very last episode in our series, Leadership from Lockdown, in partnership with Trans-Tasman Business Circle Sports Connect. What an amazing few weeks we've had with this series. I just can't believe that we're, well, in New Zealand at least, now in level 1. So the series has now spanned the whole journey for us Kiwis from level 4 right down to level 1. And as we are starting to move back into, I guess, some semblance of normality and some semblance of real life, we thought that it would be a wonderful opportunity to close down this series and move forward with some other ideas. So tune in next week for a couple of quite exciting announcements then. So today we're, and I was just having her on about this, we're signing off with an amazing final speaker for the series, someone who is not only of huge stature within the athletic community, but as of yesterday was announced as keeping her job, I shouldn't say it that way, but being reappointed as Disability Rights Commissioner in New Zealand for the next 5 years, which is a really significant appointment for us here, because she's continuing to do an amazing job. So just before I introduce her, a couple of bit of housekeeping. For those of you that are regularly with us, you'll know that we'll ask questions for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor and you can ask whatever you like to our guest speaker today. Towards the end, we'll open a very quick poll just to check how you guys are feeling now, 10 weeks into lockdown, and how you're feeling about the future as we go forward as a country and as a world dealing with COVID-19. So the final, I guess, comment I'd make here is you're all going to have to suffer me as moderator this week. So I'm stepping into some very large shoes after Ricky Swanell and Zoe George have very competently handled this season for us. So very excited to be doing this final episode today. So let's get into it. So 25th of March 2020 was a massive day in New Zealand for a couple of reasons. One was because we entered unprecedented level 4 lockdown and we were all assigned to go home and to stay there for a 4-week period. But it was also the exact same day that the Tokyo 2020 Olympic and Paralympic Games were also announced as being postponed by 12 months. So suddenly training and preparation by our Paralympians and our para-athletes worldwide came to a sudden and very unexpected halt. And we were dealing with athletes who had been in very, very intense training up until that point, who suddenly weren't even allowed to leave their homes. So a very significant change. This week we're talking to Paula Tesoriero, Chief Commissioner of the New Zealand Paralympic Team, and as I mentioned, New Zealand's Disability Rights Commissioner. So Paula has not only been planning and working with the team through to Tokyo, but is also advocating now very loudly and very cleverly in this space around making sure that disabled people are more included in society going forward and using COVID-19 as an opportunity. So without further ado, I'd love to say hello to Paula. Hi, Paula.
Kia ora, Rachel. Kia ora koutou, everyone.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your appointment yesterday, an amazing one. How are you feeling today about that?
Thanks, Rachel. I feel very privileged to be in the role that I'm in. The opportunity to help make a difference for disabled New Zealanders is just such a wonderful opportunity. So I'm very happy. Thank you.
And of course, you've spent the last 12 weeks in lockdown. How has that been for yourself and for the family?
At a personal level, it's been an incredibly busy time, and you know we'll talk soon about the impacts of COVID-19 on disabled people in New Zealand. But for those first sort of 4 to 6 weeks, it was very, very intense. So, you know, I, along with others, were working incredibly long hours and all doing it from home, you know, Zoom meetings, phone calls, all the things that we've become accustomed to now. And so work-wise, it was a really busy time, and a time where I really felt the sort of privileged pressure, if that's the right way to put it, to try and get things right for disabled New Zealanders, and doing it from your home and feeling a sense of, actually at times it was quite overwhelming. It was frustrating when we couldn't get traction on things, and then there were moments of celebration when we could get traction on things. So it was a very intense time. I'm married to Peter, and between us we've got 3 kids, so we were a bubble of 5, and one of the things that I was super impressed with was just how wonderful the 3 kids were at their self-directed learning and the resources that they had available to them online. So in many ways that was great, that I was able to focus on my job and in the knowledge that the kids were still doing well in their schooling. So I sort of didn't really put my head up for air until probably 6 weeks into it, and it's continued to be a really busy time, but such a really good opportunity as well to think about the way forward.
And we've talked about you essentially having a dual role at the moment, so the day-to-day role, and then obviously the role as chef de mission for the Paralympic team. For those people sort of less familiar with the Disability Rights Commissioner role, can you explain what that entails?
Sure. So the Disability Rights Commissioner is a statutory role, and the Act which the role sits under is the Human Rights Act of 1993. And so my role broadly is to protect and promote the rights of disabled people. And we use the term disabled people rather than people with disabilities, because in New Zealand we subscribe to the social model of disability, which says I'm not impaired by I'm not disabled rather by the individual impairment that I have, but rather I'm disabled by the barriers that society puts in place. And so when we talk about the social model, it reminds us that we all have a collective role to play in reducing those barriers. So my job is to advocate for the removal of those barriers. And there's a range of tools and opportunities I have under the legislation to do that, ranging from general advocacy right through to conducting inquiries into areas of concern. So my role sits within the Human Rights Commission. We're a national human rights institution, which obviously a number of countries around the world have, and broadly our role is to make sure that the human rights of all New Zealanders are upheld.
And then on the chef de mission side, that's a very different role again. And you've been an athlete for many, many years. And obviously for those who perhaps are a bit younger, maybe didn't see Paula win a gold medal. Probably, what was that, about 12 years ago or so, Paula, now in Beijing 2008. So what's the role of chef de mission?
Certainly doesn't feel like 12 years ago that I won my medal. Many ways it feels like yesterday. But the role of chef de mission is really about leading the New Zealand team into and at the Tokyo 2020 Games. And there's a couple of distinct parts to that. One, my role really is about making sure that the environment in the Games Village is such that our athletes and their support staff will perform to the best of their ability. And that means I've got a role in making sure that athletes have what they need, that the support staff have what they need, and also that all of the planning and the steps that we're taking going into the Games are such that give me confidence that when we're there, our team will be well placed to deliver the 22 medals that we have as a target to deliver, with 10 to 12 of those being hopefully gold medals. So, really big expectations on delivering medals and delivering results. And my job is to make sure that we have an environment in which that can happen. And then there's a degree of being the public face in a sense of the New Zealand team. So if there's media that I need to respond to or talk about publicly what's happening at the Games, then I'll be doing that. I mean, obviously we want our medal winning athletes to be the stars from a media perspective, but there is that role in making sure that the New Zealand public are aware of what's going on and dealing with any issues that come up. And then I think there's another part of the role which is about making sure that we're working with our stakeholders, with our key partners, both here and in Tokyo, to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to deliver the results that we want to deliver.
And you talked a little bit earlier about obviously the role of the Disability Rights Commissioners to protect and promote the rights of disabled New Zealanders. Can you tell us what's happened over the last 12 weeks? You know, I read an article from you yesterday, actually, where you outlined some of the very difficult challenges that our disabled people in New Zealand have faced. Can you talk us through that?
Absolutely. So I think one of the realities about COVID-19 is it's really shone the light on existing gaps that have been present actually for decades. And when you're in a situation where, as you said, it is unprecedented and things were moving fast, lots of things were uncertain at the beginning of our lockdown period, and it really highlighted those gaps. And so there were a number of things that were disproportionately impacting disabled people. And I think one of the things that's important to bear in mind is that, you know, disabled people started from behind. So we were probably going to go through this journey always a bit behind. So some particular issues that arose were things around community care workers getting access to personal protective equipment. So we faced situations where disabled people didn't want to have carers in their home because they were concerned about the spread of COVID-19. And also, naturally, we had care workers who, without that gear, were nervous about going into the homes of disabled people. So actually that put the well-being of many disabled people at risk. We also had issues around access to transport, access to food, which, you know, again, basic necessities in life. You know, accessible transport is an issue at the best of times, but when you've got reduced transport and people are trying to get to essential services and can't, that created real difficulty. And we saw disabled people relying on emergency services in a way that some people had not had to in the past. We also saw many situations where families who would otherwise have, you know, managed very well, in this situation where people couldn't access things like respite care, teacher aids, behavioural support therapies and services like that, that really exacerbated pressure on families. There were also issues around getting the voice of disabled people through into all of the planning and the pandemic response. And, you know, we weren't alone in that, but really making sure that we had a seat at the table and advocating quite strongly for that. I think one of the other things that, you know, we saw in New Zealand was a genuine fear about what was happening overseas. And at the time, you know, it's easy to look back now and think, oh gosh, thankfully we didn't have to deal with this in New Zealand. But actually at the time that we went into lockdown, we were getting reports from overseas about some people getting not for resuscitation orders, for disabled people being at the bottom of the list of, you know, who was going to get life-saving treatment. And although there hadn't been any comments in New Zealand about that at the time, and no reason for New Zealanders to actually be nervous, the reality is when disabled people are marginalised, when barriers do exist, and when many people still unfortunately see disability as a life not worth living, you know, it really created some genuine fear in the disability community in New Zealand at the time about what does this mean for disabled people. And it, for the first time, I think in a long time, it really got people thinking about actually the state might have to decide whose lives are worth living and whose lives are not worth living. And that was really profound. Thankfully, we didn't have to make those rationing decisions that they had to make in other countries. But it's really, really important that we confront some of these things so that if we face that in the future, we are well prepared and we know how to have these conversations. I think one of the other sort of things I'll just finish up on in terms of impacts was access to information. So one of the really pressing concerns from the disability community during COVID was not getting information in accessible formats. So at a time where information was changing, sometimes by the hour, disabled people were often days behind getting up-to-date information, and that put people on the back foot. So lots of work was done to remedy that, but it was quite late in the piece, and it did mean that people missed out on key information. So, you know, there were some quite negative impacts. That said, there's also been some positives that we can take out of this, and some of those positives were things like the Ministry of Health moving really quickly to create more flexible funding arrangements so that people could access their support in different ways, and that's something, you know, we really want to see continue. We did see government agencies breaking down silos and working together in a much more collaborative way for the benefit of disabled people. And again, that's something we want to see continue. And I think there's been some initiatives announced through the budget that we'll have an opportunity to influence. So, you know, I think it's, as I said at the start, it really shone the light on gaps for disabled New Zealanders, and in the spirit of the social model, you know, we've all got a responsibility to help break down those barriers.
I mean, that in itself, that the idea that there was fear in the community about choices being made about your life is just such a horrifying thought that, you know, 80% of New Zealanders wouldn't have even occurred to them that that was even something that was happening, because if you're not experienced with disability, it doesn't even you know, factor on your radar. And I think the other thing I read in your article yesterday, which was really it was quite striking, I think, just in its simplicity, was access to food, which you mentioned. And, you know, the number of people that I heard complaining about having to stand in line or not being able to get a slot on the countdown delivery or all those things, and not realizing that that's actually a life or death choice for some people in our community. They don't have that access, and they can't get a slot means they can't actually eat. So having to deal with that is just horrifying. So thank you for all of your work advocating in this space. I think it's incredibly important. I'm conscious of time ticking, and I know I can see we're starting to get some questions in now. So I'm going to ask you about the Paralympic Games before I open the floor to more questions. So as an athlete yourself, you would have had enormous empathy, I think, with what our athletes have gone through in New Zealand in the last 12 weeks. Can you explain, both from an athlete perspective and also as chef de mission, what the postponement really means?
Absolutely. Look, I think, you know, most athletes will have probably this year done what I did in 2008, when you woke up in that new year and it was, you know, this is the year of the games, everything you've been working towards. And you know, this has really caused a shift and a need to reset plans and goals. And, you know, I think we need to acknowledge that. That's pretty profound for athletes. And some athletes will do the reset and look positively towards the games much more quickly than some other athletes will be able to do. But it's certainly meant for our para athletes that, like other New Zealanders, they were locked down at home, and so relied on, you know, through the great work that Paralympics New Zealand and High Performance Sport New Zealand did, were able to kit out their garages and things and create gyms, and they were sharing that information online. Paralympics New Zealand also made sure that our athletes had access to their coaches, to sports psychologists, to sports nutritionists, and all the ordinary athlete services, you know, in an online way, and did everything they could to support athletes. And I think the big challenge really now is replanning, resetting towards the games, making, really hoping, I guess, that the rest of the world's response to COVID gets to a similar place to New Zealand, so that we have full confidence in next year, but we're full steam planning ahead towards the games. And a really big challenge within that, of course, is stretching that funding for a longer period of time. We know that 35% of the funding for Paralympics New Zealand comes from non-government sources, and at a time when the economy has been so impacted through this, that's going to create challenges for all sport, but in this case for Paralympics New Zealand. So they are working very hard and very closely with partners to try and remedy that as we head in. So look, it's been a tough time for everyone, and I guess our athletes are resilient. There's hallmarks of being an athlete, I think, that mean you sort of have to get back up, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and keep going on. But I don't think we should underestimate the impact and the profoundness of that, and what it takes to really reset and move everything a year away.
Absolutely. And for those of you that are listening, if you are keen to support our Paralympians, they are taking donations on their website, so paralympics.org.nz, if you would like to make a contribution towards helping our athletes get to Tokyo. So we've got quite a few questions now, so I'm actually going to open up to the floor. So anybody who's sitting there and has a burning question, please do drop it into the chat function, and we'll start working our way through them. So this first one's a really interesting one. And it is a question around, how does the increased movement towards working from home open up opportunities for disabled people to be more engaged in business and in careers?
Yeah, it opens up huge opportunities. So the employment stats in New Zealand are not great. So half the number, about 50% of, sorry, I'll start that stat again. Disabled people have twice the unemployment rate of non-disabled people. And with young disabled people, there's 35% of young disabled people not engaged in education, training or employment. That was pre-COVID, and that was at a time when our economy was doing really well. And so there's lots of work to be done there. And one of the really common reasons that disabled people have found it difficult to get employment is because employers won't or don't know how to make those reasonable accommodations that are often needed. And the biggest reasonable accommodation actually relates to location and flexible working hours. And so often disabled people have missed out on roles or not been able to apply for roles because there hasn't been that reasonable accommodation. And now actually working from home has become the norm for not only Kiwis, but people around the world. And I think that's really opened up our minds to seeing actually how easy it is to do this. And I'm really hoping that that continues, and that when we say we don't want to return to the way things were, that we're really genuine about that, and that employers really look at this as a way to harness the awesome skill sets that exist that they miss out on at the moment with disabled people. I think the other thing is, this interesting time we've been in has focused our minds on thinking about technology and what we can do with technology. And actually many technological advancements have benefited all people, although they've been created for disabled people. And so actually, if you're a business out there and you want to be creating some smart technology, then working with disabled people is one way to help achieve that. So I think there's huge opportunities in the employment space for disabled people coming out of this, especially if we are really genuine to that idea of holding on to flexible working options.
And I think one of the things, obviously, that is quite prevalent is unconscious bias within the employment environment. Is this an opportunity to reset? Can New Zealand become more inclusive, and how do we do that?
that's always my hope, that we continue to be more inclusive. You're right about, there are a number of myths around why employers are reluctant to hire disabled people, and actually when you can really bust those myths down actually, and they just don't stack up to the evidence. And also stigma and low expectations that people can often have of disabled people. And we've got a responsibility and an opportunity to really create a social change movement, which is in part what Paralympic sport is all about. One of its key goals is creating that social change movement, and big opportunity to do that coming out of this. And I think that we have to seize the opportunity to really create a more diverse and inclusive New Zealand coming out of this. We're going to see, we're already seeing inequities that have been generated through COVID, and we've seen inequities that have been highlighted that have already existed. And a way in which we can start to address those is by creating a much more inclusive New Zealand and having equity as a real focus of where we get to.
And it's quite a good transition into one of the questions we have here, and a question I have as well, is obviously you're very active within the women in sport community still, and we see you quite often at different parts of that sector. This inclusivity, how do we extend that into sport? And I'll talk about that through the gender lens, but also through the disability lens. Can we do better in sport?
Oh, we can absolutely do better. I mean, starting from the disability perspective, sport's a great leveller, and sport is a way in which, from a very young age, non-disabled children can observe how disabled kids can participate in sport. And so right from a very young age, sport creates that really lovely opportunity for people to see what inclusion is all about. I think from a gender lens, Paralympic sport has come a long way on that front. So at the Rio Games, there was double the number of female athletes that there was back in 1996 in Atlanta. And in Rio, 43% of women competed in 43% of all of the medal events. And, again, that was an increase on the London Games by about 12%. So, you're seeing that participation grow. But that said, the number of women who stood for the IPC board, is still lower than we would hope. So I think, we've all got those challenges. And I think that, women across all abilities and across all types of sport, have faced over the years that push for equality. And when you add impairment to that, you've sort of got that double whammy, or that sort of what we call intersectionality between those two identities. And I think the big challenge for para-athletes is not so much about the gender, although that is a focus, and it's one that both the International Paralympic Committee and Paralympics New Zealand are really mindful of. I think actually the bigger challenge is that equity between parasport and non-parasport. I still remember, and admittedly it was 12 years ago and we've come a long way, but the celebration of and recognition of my gold medal was poles apart from Olympic gold medalists, and that really sticks with me as such a point of inequity. And so I think for para athletes there is that double whammy of inequity, and I always encourage women's organisations to really focus on the fact that women are not a homogenous group of people. We have multiple identities, and we need to do better across all fronts.
And that transitions quite well into this question. So we see the areas of sport and recreation merging. So where does this now enhance opportunities for people with disabilities, or disabled people, to use your phrasing, to participate in community sport?
I think, community sport is where it all starts, right? It's that pathway towards elite competition. And both Paralympics New Zealand and organisations like the Halberg Foundation here in New Zealand do great work at trying to open up opportunities for young disabled people in community sport. I think the trick is for every club in every national sporting organisation in New Zealand to think about the disability lens across their sport. Is their sport accessible? Is their club accessible? Is there representation on their board, on their club, membership and secretariats? And, how can they make their sport more accessible? And I'd encourage clubs and sports organisations to touch base with Paralympics New Zealand, with the Halberg Foundation, and try and make your sport more accessible, because access to sport and rec, it is one of those rights that we've enshrined in the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and New Zealand signed up to that. We've all got obligations and responsibilities around that. The government's recent package of budget announcements also will be investing more in this area. And, I think that it's not good enough to be a club anymore in New Zealand and not have that disability lens to what it is that you're doing. 24% of New Zealanders are disabled. It's a huge share of the population, and sport and recreation is critical for everyone.
And it's interesting, just to touch on an earlier point you made, the women in sport community has been quite vocal about our concerns about women's sport being cut in terms of finances and resourcing because of COVID-19. And are you seeing that in the disability space as well? Is disabled sport sitting in the loss side of the profit and loss, and therefore is exposed to risk?
I think all sport is exposed to risk right now, and I think particularly when there is that reliance on government funding, but also a share of the funding that comes from the private sector and other charitable sort of donations and things. All of that's going to be slimmer in this environment, and so that is going to, I think, require a change in the way that sport's organised, the way that it's run, and that's going to be a real challenge. Hopefully it's also an opportunity, but I think that disability sport will have the same challenges, and that's why I'm really hoping that sport in New Zealand will, we can target some of that investment to really promote inclusion.
So we're gonna jump out of over to Malaysia. Actually, we've got Lee Nyao Tai, who is beaming in. Congratulations to you and to New Zealand for progressing so much. You have come a long way for disabled people. Malaysia is still quite behind in inclusivity for the disabled community, and for education in society is not there. What is your advice, and what are the steps that Malaysia and other countries alike can take to move us forward faster to becoming a more disabled friendly country, and how can sport be used to expedite that process?
Whew, there's a lot in that. Thank you for that question. I think my starting place would be that, I think often it can be tempting for us to compare ourselves to different countries, and people will often say to me in my role, oh, but Paula, you know, we're doing so well compared to this country or that country. But actually, we're not doing as well as we can do as a country. And that's by our own standards. But also, you know, the United Nations have told us in our first examination of how New Zealand's going against our international obligations, they've said, you know, we're not doing well enough and we need to do more. And, you know, I think that we need to really judge our performance by what disabled New Zealanders think. And at the end of the day, you know, it's never going to be good enough, in my view, for us to be a little bit behind in New Zealand. Actually, we don't want to be behind at all. I think to offer some thoughts and reflections for other countries, you know, I think obviously being party to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is pretty pivotal. And what that does is then create those domestic obligations within countries. And if you can then get that enshrined in domestic legislation, then that's even better. What we did in New Zealand that I think has helped frame the way that we have progressed some rights is we have a New Zealand disability strategy, and then underneath that we have an action plan which has been developed in partnership between government and disabled people, and that has set some shared commitments. Now that hasn't been easy to develop over the years, but we're now in a position where it's become much more of a natural thing to do. So I think some of that architecture and framing helps, but I wouldn't want anyone to be under the illusion that we are there in New Zealand, because we are most certainly not across, you know, housing, education, transport, a lack of data about disabled people, our employment stats. You know, we have far too many disabled people in poverty in New Zealand. So, you know, we have a long way to go, despite the fact we have made some inroads in some places, like other countries.
Another question here, can you share the changing role for carers in the future? Will there be more demand? And if so, do we have the labour force to meet those needs?
No, we don't have the labour force at the moment. That workforce development and how we actually cater for our older, you know, we have an ageing population in New Zealand, and we have, you know, our disability population. And so workforce development's a really big thing. And the role of carers, I think it will change as in the sense that the model now that New Zealand is trying to move to is around disabled people having the choice and control over who cares for them. So in the past, it's been, well, here's your selection of organisations, and now it's much more geared towards what do disabled people want at an individual level. And I think that's going to change the nature of the way organisations operate. It opens up opportunities for families to also care for people. There's been some changes in respect of that. And also you're going to see people who can contract with individuals to provide their care. So lots of changes in that space. It's referred to as system transformation if people want to go and find out more about it on the Ministry of Health website.
And another question, you describe the definition of disabilities as extending beyond the physical. Where does your work actually end if socioeconomic barriers are? A big question.
Yeah, so the way that the International Convention talks about disability is it's physical, it's psychological, sensory. It covers a very broad spectrum. And so to the extent that, I talked about the social model and the barriers that exist, those barriers are across most every facet of life. So, I think I pretty much deal with almost every government agency, obviously some more than others, but, there's no service or product that is created in New Zealand that doesn't have to meet the needs of disabled people. And so it's a very broad ambit in that respect. And, I work with stakeholders who represent people from all types of different impairments. And it's one of the things that I love about my job, because I've really grown and learned about such a wide range of impairments that I was less familiar with, a decade ago.
So we've probably got time for one or two more questions. So here's a big Paralympic one. You medalled in Beijing and now you lead the New Zealand team to Tokyo. Are there any differences between competing in Asia compared to competing in the rest of the world for disabled people?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think I'd be interested in other people's views on that. I think that I'm not sure so much as I'd see it as sort of almost kind of ethnic based. I think different parts of the world, in terms of attitudes towards disabled people, in terms of socioeconomic status, how far the rights of disabled people have been advanced. I think all of those things impact. And, I think that, one of the things that was talked about in Beijing, and it's been talked about around Tokyo, but it also was talked about in London, was how do you use the Paralympics to really create that driving power of inclusion. And I don't think, in my mind, I don't necessarily see it as different ethnic groups that are more advanced than others. I think there's a wide range of things that go into that are probably too complex to get into today. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Well, I can see that Sharon's popped up, so I'm going to ask one last question, then hand over to her to wrap things up. And I'm going to pick this one because it actually feeds into a thought I'd had earlier when you were talking about COVID-19 and the impact on our disabled Kiwis. So where does your work end and mental health issues in organisations start? And my question is, has lockdown adversely affected our disabled community in New Zealand, and are you seeing an emergence of mental health issues, for example?
So in terms of my work around mental health, yes, it absolutely is included in that definition of disability. And so very much I have an interest and an involvement in that area of work. Like, I think that time will tell. We are a country that has really, been grappling with some very significant issues around mental health and suicide. And, lots of work has been done to really try and change all of that. And, big investments made last year to address some of that. My suspicion is that we will see an increase in the number of people wanting to access different types of support services, and I'm basing that really only on the likely scenarios of the impact on our economy, the social impact and inequities that have already arisen through COVID and will be with us for the coming years. And if we get another wave of this, then that's another very difficult period to go through. So I think, my sense is we will, see an increase, but to what extent, how much, and how well the country can respond, I think remains to be seen. But I think that, you know, a really, perhaps a nice way to finish that question is that sense that we are all in this together. And, you know, that's been a real sort of catchphrase from the beginning of this. And I think, you know, we need to look to our communities, we need to look towards each other and really keep an eye out for each other.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Paula. We've run out of time, and I apologise to everybody that still had questions waiting. There were quite a few of them there. So if you are still keen to have those answered, you can email those through to us and we can pass them on to Paula. And if she has a moment, I'm sure she'll be able to get back to you. I'm going to hand over to Sharon, but just quickly say before I do, a massive thank you to Sharon, to Dora, to Tracy, and all of the team at the Trans-Tasman Business Circle for their epic support over the last 10 weeks as we conduct the Leadership from Lockdown series. I feel a bit sad that we're bringing it to an end actually after all of this time, but it's been a wonderful few weeks. A huge thank you again to Ricky Swanell and Zoe George for moderating through the series, and to all of our speakers all over the world. We've bounced around a bit, from Auckland to Zurich to Dublin to London to Melbourne, and back to Auckland, and it really has been amazing. So I'll hand over to Sharon now, but thank you everyone for dialing in.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to you and Paula for your time today. The poll is in front of you now. For those of you who join us regularly, you'll be familiar with this. If you wouldn't mind answering those questions, and I'll give you the results before we sign off. Paula, thank you so much for your time today. What an honour to host you, and you know, you certainly gave us such brilliant insights into the communities in which you work together with, and certainly a lot of things for me to consider that I hadn't, and I'm sure many people on the call would feel the same. So really appreciated you being so open and honest about sharing across so many different topics today. We got a lot of things covered, so thank you for that. It really was a brilliant way to conclude the series. And Rachel, we've loved working together with you, sending the love right back to you and Women in Sport Aotearoa. It's been a wonderful series, and I remember us talking very early on in week 4 of lockdown and saying we have to do something, and I think that we can be very proud of what we've pulled together over the last 10 weeks and the amazing conversations that we've had, and we've just loved every minute of it. So thank you so much to you. So the poll's in front of you now. Excellent. We're still feeling innovative. 77% of us, 92% believe the government doing a good job in this crisis. Majority believing 12 months is an estimate of when this will be over. And priority of women and girls during recovery phase, medium is the average here, 54%. So thank you again to both of you, and Paula, I'll hand over to you to say goodbye to everyone.
Ngā mihi nui. Thank you, Rachel, Sharon, Dora, Tracy, and others, and people who have brought this together. I think it's a great idea, great concept. You know, I think that we're at a really, really interesting time globally, but you know, in New Zealand around, you know, this time of rebuild. And you know, in part, yeah, that's about literally rebuilding and investing in infrastructure, and there's big opportunities to, you know, build in concepts of universal design and make New Zealand a more accessible place. But it's also about rebuilding, I think, as a nation, and, you know, reflecting on those gaps that we all saw. And, you know, I think for the first time, probably, non-disabled New Zealanders got a taste of what it's like to be restricted in their movement, to feel a sense of loneliness and isolation. And, you know, I hope that a positive from that is that we all become a bit more empathetic, and that we can all start to think about our collective role in reducing barriers and creating equity. And sport has a big role to play in that, because it's about participation. And I think we've got to, you know, every club, every sport in New Zealand has a responsibility to really make their sport accessible. And that's great for sport, and it's great for New Zealand. So thank you to everyone who has been listening. Please feel free to get in touch at any stage on any of the issues that I've talked about, and those that you you haven't had a chance to ask about, and let's keep this really important conversation going. So ngā mihi nui kia koutou.